really just like all those great riffs. It's one riff and the band. It's not even 3 parts. It's 2 parts. It's melody and then rapping is really fascinating because it's rhythmic in nature. So you can actually have rapping be the lead or the counter melody at any given time. It's a really fun thing to play with. And so as you're blending and you're putting your mixes together, you have to identify who's the counter melody. And then they've got to be balanced so that they're not the king of the castle, but above and lifted out of the rhythm section, right? And so pan can do that because you could have them appear on the right or the left or in stereo on the left or right or outside, I should say the side of your mid of the lead vocal. And that's a good way to distinguish what is the counter melody because your groove is in the bass and the snare and the kick. That's up the center. And then you have your lead vocal up the center and then the backgrounds come in on the side and they sing some really cool counter melody or something like that. In this case, how you blend your guitars would be as part of the band or if the band is doing the counter melody. So really thinking about this, don't overthink it, but as you're highlighting things, if it's the 4th element, it's just confusing. And I was too many 4th elements. Like in my records, there was 4th element. There was a 5th element. When I go back and dissect these, I'm like, man, what was I doing? Everybody's playing on top of each other. And not only does it make it hard to get a loud master because there's too much signal at once, it's just confusing for the listener. So to unpack that.
Keep it simple, stupid is the lesson.
Well, anything more than 3 elements or senses is going to kind of confuse the brain. And while the record can handle it from a technical, mechanical canvas standpoint,
it might actually, not artistically be a good move.
Yeah, and it opens up headroom too. So that's always good. So, and this is a tangent at this point, but really being aware of how many things you highlight. And then also, I love when mixes move around. So like, when you ride the fader of a volume fader, maybe it's sectional. Maybe in the next section, the acoustic guitar comes up on the right a little bit. And then on the next section, the acoustic on the left comes up a little bit. And maybe they have a little dance that they do. Who knows? These kind of things are really interesting, but that's not necessarily taking counter melody. That's still band, but you can create some sectional
flow,
lift and move and flow while still being part of the band. That's not breaking the 3-rule law. So it's not a law. It's just some guides from Jack Joseph Puig and that have served me very well. But the three elements thing and really being mindful of that is really powerful because once you learn it and it becomes one, you forget it and then you're not going to think about it again. Because then every time you bring the 4th element in, it confuses you as the mixer and you're like, oh, too far. But you have to get used to that, So that's another long story short. The 3 elements at once, melody, counter melody, and band is a great way to start. And then consider for mixers, if you want a big cavey reverby sound, that reverb has to be considered an element because the second you cover it up with other faders, you've lost the thing, which is the texture of that really cool reverb and that track. So there is a less is more element, but that's also where getting rid of high end can be your friend because if you mute things like a DJ with a filter or a lo-fi thing, you're clearing up what exists in the high end and then you can hear reverb better or the air on Lauren Daigle's voice. So really fun stuff. Mixing is definitely one of my loves of doing it and I love when it feels effortless. I love when you've reached that place where you just like know what to do and you're like, it just kind of happens and that's a great place to be. Repetitions.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that I remember you talking about on that Recording Studio Rockstars episode was you talked about automating parallel compression throughout the song to give the vocals lifts in the chorus.
Yeah.
Is that still something you're working on?
Yeah. In every mix and production I do, there is multiple layers of parallel compression everywhere from individual instruments to the master bus. I stack parallel compression. I don't care. So that's another secret of mixing is parallel compression. And the sooner, if you're not using parallel compression and you need a primer on it, don't use the wet dry knob. Wet dry knob is technically parallel compression, but it adds a mental math factor to understanding what parallel compression is instead of using it the way mastering engineers use it, which is much, much more of a mixer's tool. And I'll explain that now. Basically, when a mastering engineer needs volume, one of the things they'll do is duplicate your source and then compress it and then fade that in from 0 up to unity. But the essence of this is that your original signal stays where it is. And so the problem is that if you just put a compressor on a signal and you dial it from 0 to 100, the overall level of your signal stays the same and the character of how much compression is changing. But that's cool if you overcompress something fast and you want to back off. That's great. But that's not how we use parallel compression in practice. In practice, what they used to call New York style compression, which was where you'd feed an EQ in front of the compressor to get bass and highs, but they did it on a console. So on the SSL console at the top in the routing matrix, you could duplicate the signal going to the channel fader and without degrading it, because you're putting up an amp. It's not a passive source, right? So the inline stays where it was, and it duplicates it to a secondary fader, and then you compress the snot out of the secondary fader, and then you flood it up from underneath. And so the best way to do this is to grab an 1176 because it's sort of ubiquitous at this point, and it has a nice distortion character, and then smack the crap out of it. So duplicate your fader, smack the crap out of it with an 1176, solo it, just beat it up, make it sound ridiculous, and then pull it all the way down to 0, and then feather it in from up underneath, flood water through the basement floor, right? Of this, and you'll notice that not only does it not sound like crap, it sounds awesome, and then once you've got a level that you're like, whoa, that is really forward and powerful and huge. Oh my God, this is awesome. Then start playing with the attack and release settings, and you'll hear how you can change the compression character of the parallel source and how that changes your sound. So maybe you roll the attack lazy and then more consonants come through. Or maybe there's too many consonants in the original vocal, so you put attack really fast because you want to clip all those T's and P's and B's and things that would be transient. So maybe you don't want those added in. You want to get rid of those. And what you're looking for is more low-level information and body. A fast attack would do that, but a slow attack would enhance the transients. So if this was an acoustic guitar, maybe the parallel compression, you want to enhance the high strings, which were played by your pinky and ring finger, which were dynamically played crappier because it's your pinky and ring finger, but you need them to be just as big as the stuff you played with the pick and your thumb and your forefingers, which has all the control of your right hand, right? So you might EQ the highs a little bit to boost into the compressor, then compress until all the low stuff is getting smacked down, but the highs are just getting massaged, and then you feather that in, you'll get more highs in your parallel compression mix, or vice versa. Maybe you beat it up until it's nice and woofy, and then you feather that in, and now your signal source is warm, and you're getting all the benefits of all that. So the only caveat I'll give you here is that high-pass filters rotate 90 degrees. That's part of the nature of what it does. So be careful. If you are to high-pass filter your parallel compression line, you're now out of phase with the original. You're going to get a very cold, thin signal source. It'll still sound parallel compressed, but it's going to be really cold, and it's going to be missing all that beautiful low end. So you have to be very careful. One way would be to apply the exact same plugins on both faders, just don't do the thing you're doing on one that's the clean channel. So i.e., if you put a high-pass filter on your parallel compression, you have to put a high-pass filter on your regular one, your clean channel, because now they both rotate at 90 degrees, so you're still in sync, right? No comb filtering, no funny business.
So you just leave it at like 20 hertz, and then the other one you do to wherever.
Yeah, try it. I mean, it'll work sometimes and it won't work other times, but yes, that's better than if you just did 90 hertz high-pass on one, because then it would phase against itself weird. You get a quarter wave phase because it's 90 degrees. It'd be all bad. So, because remember, one sample of latency is a high pass filter, right? So automatic delay compensation and phase rotation are really important when you're dealing with stacking up a mix. You ever notice that sometimes you like record like a tube amp or something, and now the waveform is no longer symmetrical up and down? And that's because there was some degree of a high-pass filter somewhere in the circuit, and it rotated the phase 90 degrees. And so you'll have more on the positive or negative side than evenly dispersed. Again, now we get back to optimizing the canvas, and it's really important stuff, especially how things hit your final peak limiter. If you've got everything way too far on one side of the canvas, it's going to prematurely hit the peak limiter, and you're going to have transients that exist more positive than negative or more negative than positive, and that they're getting summed mono, but they're going to be higher than they would be if you were to rotate the phase correctly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how the whole gestalt is in your head as you're working on a record. You're thinking about the master basically from the very get-go of the mix, and I think it's important to understand that big process.
Yeah, it's tricky, but you know what happens is, here's the truth: you think about these things for a year or two, and you really work on them, and then you forget. It's one thing to talk to you on this podcast about them, but it's another thing that you're in the moment, you don't want to be thinking about this stuff. So you just make it part of your practice. Playing with phase is something I do on every single element that I add in. And I do it at the point of I've done my tracking, and then I consider it what we would call in the film world, they call it post-production, color correction, editing, all that stuff. So I call that post-production in the studio. Clients understand that too, which is nice. So bring my guitar player Chris in, record all the guitar parts for this country record, and then he will leave, and I'll send the client away, and then I render 3 mics to 1 mic, and then I do my edit quantizing and comping and pasting and blah, 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 panning, and I do all that. And then I do all my re-engineering like we talked about, and I do all my phase coherence stage and make sure everything's great. And then I shoot them a mix and let them hear it for the first time, and they're like, wow, this is great. And then I bring my bass player in. And then I do bass. Well, bass is easy. It's a mono fader, and it's a great bass player, dynamic phase rotation, great. And I'm still maximizing the canvas, and everything's great. And at this point, the client knows what record they're going to get, so there's no surprises. And then from there, I'll usually do keys and drums by myself because I play keys and drums. So I'll set it up and I'll do my thing, and then I send them the file. And 9 times out of 10, it's remote local vocal recordings because of the nature of a post-COVID world. Most of my clients are anywhere in the world but Nashville, which is funny. I do have Nashville clients, but like 7 out of 10 are remote. And so people record their vocals themselves. So what I do is I make sure there's a click in front so that it can all line up again. And then, and then it's fixing badly engineered vocals more often than not. So using AI intelligent plugins that are like the Sculptor from Isotope, that's pretty cool. And then again, Soothe, great. And then a lot of harmonics. I love Max Bass on fixing bad recordings. Max Bass is really good on vocals and guitars and stuff to add that psychoacoustic harmonics without over pushing the frequency you pick. I don't know if you ever dug into Max Bass, but that's a great plugin.
Wait, is that the Waves one, Max Bass?
Yeah. It's a staple.
Mm-hmm. It's like our bass, but there's a bit more like you can play with it a bit more.
Yeah, and then also I think our bass does some interesting things on its own too. I think our bass is like an expander as well, but they're different. They're kind of tied together, but different. Yeah, but Max Bass is just the harmonic part of it without any other stuff. And so I use that a lot on a bad acoustic guitar recording, bad vocal recording to bring in some better fundamentals. And so you set the corner frequency to the fundamental of, so like if it's a low guy voice, it's about 150.
Whatever it takes. So circling back to what we talked about before we even started recording this episode, you mentioned that you've learned tons of lessons from your mom's real estate business. Is there anything? What are some of those lessons? Because I'm sure that there's some good stuff here for the audience.
Back when I was engineering, again, late 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't any business curriculum available to learn from. There wasn't anybody who was sharing their secrets in the business side of things because music business is still pretty shady as far as I'm concerned. Like, yeah, that's great people and whatever, but it's all very, I should say, shaded. There's a lot of people that want to cover what's going on. They don't want people to know because it's better that way, right? And so there's the feeling of competition. Like, well, I don't want to share my secrets because this person's my competition. I've never really felt that way. I want to live in a world where the uniqueness of what I do means that I have no competition except my bettering myself. So I try to live that way and talk on these podcasts with some openness that way and not hide these details because they were hidden from me on purpose. And so, a big part of this music industry is a hustle, and it's a hustle to get people to hire you. It's a hustle to give them what they're looking for. And it's a hustle because you're working with people's dreams and also your own career dreams. And so the hustle in this sense isn't always a bad thing because hustle and bustle is getting around quickly and making deals. So when I was working at Starbucks, after about a year and a half, I started dating my boss, Julia, And she was 2 or 3 years older than I was, and we kind of fell in love. And that was a 3.5-year relationship. It was my first like adult relationship. And so very quickly realized I could no longer work at Starbucks because it was just too much of you need separation of church and state,
Yeah,
And so
I'm with you.
I then